Today we're going to be talking about campaigns and elections in Texas. Historically, the way the situation has worked out is people would just basically file the information or file their candidacy and then run for whatever office they actually wanted to run for. Part of the problem with that is as time moved forward, we became more reliant on political consultants. So instead of just the one person running for office, this person now needed someone who actually understood the process of elections. And so they would hire these consultants who would do really, really good jobs of like getting poll numbers done for them, knowing exactly what people actually, needed to say in order to win a particular election. And it got to the point where you started seeing more consultants involved in the process and kind of moving away from the original reason why people actually went to run for office in the first place. And so one of the problems we kind of ran into with the system is as political consultants got involved in the situation, the other side, if they didn't have one, they quite often suffered from the inability to actually compete with the other person. And so what you ended up with is very one-sided elections until both sides started hiring consultants. And these are usually people who are experts on all sorts of things like rhetoric, how to actually communicate with other people. And so a lot of these people would have communication degrees, and they'd really understand exactly what words you needed to say in order to actually win a particular election. Well, as more and more of this happened, it got to a point where literally there was no way to win an election without actually having these types of people. So what that ended up adding to the system was money, and lots of money being added to these campaigns. Whereas before, like I said, people could actually run for office without having to really dig deep into the finances. But now, as people realized they needed really, really professional people in order to actually win a particular election, they put more money into it. And in order to get more money, sometimes they had to go to other sources to actually get it. And quite often that meant somebody who wanted something in return or would want something in return after the person was elected. And so there's been a move in the last couple of decades to move towards or to have people running for office that are already independently wealthy so they don't rely on any of these donations. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting a good person. What it generally meant was somebody who wasn't particularly reliant on money sources that had a tendency of causing people to be elected or not be elected. And so whether or not that's a good thing or not that they've changed in this process, we don't really know. But what it may actually mean is very rich people may be required in order to run for office, in order to defeat people who actually have a lot of money already set in the system for them. So one of the attempts was actually made to actually do what's called campaign finance reform. And so they put forth legislation saying you couldn't actually have all of this money without it being reported, because once you had it reported, people would then know who's actually backing a particular candidate. The problem with that is the Supreme Court has turned down a lot or struck down a lot of these rules and legislative approaches, both in the states and the federal government, which makes it really difficult to monitor where money is coming from. So it's still a big problem. And without accountability, who knows where money's actually coming from and who's actually influencing people and constantly continuing to influence them going forward. And so moving on to other issues, what happened was we started creating what's called the ballot form. And so the idea was to move away from partisan elections and kind of make it so the right person got elected. And so in the beginning, before this actually happened, we had what's called the party column format. And what that meant was you'd have like all Republicans. So like if you press this button, if you check this box, it would say all Republicans. And so that became a part of the process. And then over the years, people realized, okay, we need to distance ourselves from that. So we get away from parties controlling government as opposed to people controlling government. Whether or not one or the other is a better thing is a completely debatable. But that was an attempt to move away from that. Hasn't really been all that successful. But one of the processes they have worked into the system now is they have what's called a party column format, which means you can choose Democrat or Republican, but then as you're going through the rest of the ballot, if you choose somebody else, that vote overrides pretty much the entire party line vote that we had. The other process or the other approach that we use these days is called the office block format. And if you voted before, you've probably seen it quite often because it's really used quite often. And that's where, like if it's somebody running for president, it'll be all the choices of the people running for president. Then if it's whatever office or whatever amendment or whatever regulation or stipulation that's actually in the voting process, it'll be put in its own little box, and then the yes or no or these choices. And so that works a little bit better, so it stays away from the party line sort of thing. But again, there's a lot of parties have a lot invested in the whole concept of trying to keep their party in power. So they're going to put a lot of emphasis and a lot of power behind keeping that process going. So how does actually somebody get onto a ballot? Well, the way it generally works is somebody gets a bunch of signatures. Usually there's a form of some sorts that they actually have to fill out, it's set in the way that it actually works. So they'll go around and they'll stand in front of, your local grocery store and try to get people to actually vote, or to register to vote for their party. Now, the way it works is for a statewide position, you need at least 1% of the vote of people who voted before, 1% of people who voted before to actually sign your petition. So if you had 400,000 people who voted in a particular state, then you would need 4,000 people in order to actually register in order to vote. So if you got 4,440,000, you get the idea of how the numbers actually work. For a multi-county, you need 5% of that population of the people who originally voted before. And also in counties, just in general, it's also 5%. The reason for it is you just don't want a whole lot of, people just throwing their names onto the ballot. So you end up, every time you go to vote, you've got, 30,000 names on the ballot, which makes it impossible to actually make a vote. So that's kind of where the process was actually designed that way, or has been changed to work that way. So for the nomination process, in order to get to an election itself, we'll have both minority and majority parties. And so for a minority party, which is considered 5 to 19% of the previous election, so let's say the Reform Party was running last year, or last election, and they got 7% of the vote, let's just say that's what the actual numbers were, well, that would mean they qualify as a minority party to actually be considered to be put on ballots going forward. But if they fall below the 5%, level, the next election, they don't qualify as a minority party. They basically have to end up being what's called a write-in candidate. Majority parties, which obviously are above 19%, which there are only two of them, at least in Texas right now, and that's the Republicans and the Democrats. Well, there are a bunch of third parties that are trying to make it to those numbers, but a lot of people see these people who are actually on there and these parties that are on there and go, well, I'm throwing my vote away. And so they tend to vote specifically for one of the two main parties, which makes it really, really difficult for any third party to actually get involved in the nomination process. So the way the majority party works, okay, so the minority parties tend to work on party caucuses, which is a huge get-together, and they kind of all decide who they actually want to vote, whereas the majority party has a number of different ways that they can actually do this. And Texas has what's called a semi-open, and sometimes it's semi-closed primary. But the different delineations of that are different, open primaries tend to be anybody can actually vote for somebody running for office for that particular party, whereas a closed primary means you have to be registered in that particular party. Now, like I mentioned, semi-open and semi-closed, which means you can kind of jump in and vote for somebody else, but there's usually a certain amount of time that you actually have in order to do it, like 60 to 90 days. And that's to keep people from just going in and voting for every other party. Part of the problem that we've actually run into in the past, or perceived problem, is that people from other parties might actually come over and try to cause an election to get turned the other way by voting for the other party. Like they'll go to say it's a Democrat running for office, and he or she wants to win, so the people in that particular party, or in the Republican Party, don't want them to actually win. What they'll do is they'll have their entire party come over and vote for somebody who literally has no chance in the actual main election. And so that sort of thing is perceived to happen, but the chances of it being successful are pretty slim, because the amounts of people that you would need to actually get together to do something like that has never really been all that beneficial or capable. So whereas it could happen in the future, especially with a lot of internet based registration and internet based collaborations, maybe it could happen in the future. But so far, it hasn't actually been a real problem so far. So that does bring us to like crossover voting. So if you're in one party and you want to vote into the other party for their primary, you're allowed to do it, but you have to register, like I said, based off of whether it's an open or closed primary. Now, if it's closed, you don't really have a choice, but open can be all sorts of things kind of going on or nothing going on. What also happens is after an election, in some states, you will have what's called runoff primaries, which means of the people who are running in the primary, they didn't get a majority of the vote. So they have what's called a runoff, which requires yet another election. And then whoever wins that one ends up being the main candidate kind of going forward. So now financing of elections, now the financing itself, usually it's taken care of by the states. But in order to run for office, you need to file to run for office. Now, in the past, it used to be really, really expensive. And so what happened was, realizing that this was only benefiting major parties or people who had a lot of money, the states decided, okay, this is really a bad thing. So they lowered the prices, especially in Texas. So to run statewide, you need at least you need $3,750. It's a filing fee. If you're running for the county and it's a less than 200,000 resident county, it's $1,250. If it's, I'm sorry, that's more than 200,000 people. If it's under 200,000 people, then it's $750. So it kind of, like I said, statewide, 3,750. Above 200,000 residents for a county is 1,250. And for below that, which is below 200,000, it's basically $750. Now that's how much it is right now. That could change, and that all depends on kind of the way money works and over time, inflation, all sorts of things like that. So we do have special elections in Texas. We had one very recently when one of the Congress members basically was kind of shamed out of office. And so what ends up happening is the governor will call for a special election, and then people will actually vote for whoever that person is to replace that person, at least until the time comes for a regular standard election. We don't have too many of them on the, like say the House of Representatives. And part of the reason for that is the elections happen every 2 years anyway. So sometimes it's just easier to just kind of wait it out. Whereas the Senate, the elections are every 6 years. So if somebody loses a position then or passes away or something to that effect, you're going to want to replace somebody as soon as possible, because that's a lot of time to have your state without an actual representative. So in 1965, one second. Sorry about that. My throat's kind of going out right there. So in 1965, we tried to solve one of the problems that was happening, and that was states that were keeping people from actually voting, people who should legitimately vote. And so what they did is they created what was called the Federal the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so this was in 1965. And so this was signed by Lyndon Johnson. And the idea is if you try to change your state laws, because remember, states are where voting actually occurs and where most of the rules occur. But if you tried to change your laws without any notification, then basically you couldn't do it. So what this meant was, with the Voting Rights Act, is if you decided you wanted to change some stipulation to your laws, like in Texas, they wanted to add voter ID. So if you wanted to vote, you needed an identification. But in order to do that, it had to be past the federal system. So federal judges would look at it and decide, yeah, this is good, this is okay, this is not okay, this is constitutional, this is not constitutional. And so that sort of thing had to happen. Well, it got struck down, or at least Section 4, which is the part where Texas was trying to push this forward. And so Section 4 got struck down, which then allowed states to actually override some of the rules that they had before and didn't have to go through the federal approval process. And so this has kind of changed things. It's kind of diminished a bit of the Federal Voting Rights Act, but at the same time, there are still huge stipulations that, you know, where people couldn't vote before, poll taxes and all sorts of other things. Well, those have actually been curtailed, so we don't run into that problem, hopefully, in the future. So one of the things we've tried to do, not just in Texas, but pretty much everywhere, is what's called absentee and early voting. So the idea is that, well, originally it was designed for, like, not students. Originally it was never designed for students. Originally it was designed for soldiers. So they were serving overseas and they couldn't get back to vote, but it was felt because they're, you know, serving our country, they should have the right to actually vote for the system that they live in, you know, when they come home. And so the idea was to provide some other form where they could early vote in the process, and it had to be early voting or you wouldn't get a final vote on the day of the election. So they set that up. Um, and so before 1979 in Texas, if you wanted to absentee vote, you actually had, I mean, you didn't have to be a soldier at that time, but you had to sign an affidavit saying that you were going to be outside of the county during the actual election. Well, after 1979, what happened was if you were a citizen of Texas and you wanted to vote early, you can. And so basically you just have to put in the paperwork beforehand, say you're actually going to be voting. It's called early voting, which means the voting begins 17 days before the actual election, and it has to be concluded 4 days before the election is actually over. Again, this gives them time to actually tally the votes as part of the main numbers. So you don't end up with an election where somebody wins and then a couple of days later you find out somebody else won because the early voting or the absentee voting got tabulated to be different. You definitely wouldn't want that democracy system that we have set up here. So, or a republic. So these are some of the things to kind of keep in mind when it comes to elections in Texas. There's a lot of other little things and nuances and all that, but that should at least get you started on the idea of these are some of the things and struggles that we're kind of going through in Texas, and we're constantly trying to make things better, and in some cases probably making things worse because that's how politics is. So thank you for listening to today's lecture and hope you learned something.